Well, if you're ready to begin, you're good to go.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. We have pizza, drinks, and salads over there. We also have our New York Times QR code over there if you'd like to check out the free New York Times resources the university has to offer. And we also have a sign up there with all of our social media if you'd like to stay in touch with us. And our next Times Talk will be on the 22nd at this time, back in this location, and it's about the crisis in the Ukraine, given by Dr. Amber Nickel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Atkins.
Well, thank you so much. I would encourage you to attend Dr. Nichols too. I'm going to try to make it for that as well. I'm very interested in hearing what she's up to. She's been very involved in that project. She did a Fulbright over in Ukraine as well, so very knowledgeable. So welcome. My name's Dr. Greg Atkins. I am an adjunct history instructor for the history department here. And my presentation today is called City Business, Colorado Springs and the Libertarian Party. This is a picture of City Hall in Colorado Springs around 1975 that I pulled from the archive there in Colorado Springs. Debates that happened right here in the 1920s, I'm going to argue, provided a very foundational basis for what becomes the Libertarian Party of the United States, which is today the third largest political party in the United States. So much of why that happened was because of what happens right here in Colorado Springs. So the movement in Colorado Springs, it starts in the 1920s. That movement honed messaging, it organized tactics, and it built allies over half a century that will eventually kind of create the rise of the Libertarian Party and the establishment of the Libertarian Party in 1971. So to talk about that, I'm going to do kind of a number of things. I'm going to start out in 1971 and that immediate cause of the Libertarian Party of the United States organizing. So I'll start out there in 71. And then I'll explore taxes and corporations back into U.S. history. So I'll back us up 150 years or so, a little more than that. I'll back us up into history talking about taxes and corporations to give us just kind of a broad historical background. And then I'll jump to debates over the city government in Colorado Springs that start in the 1920s. And then we'll move forward from the 1920s until, again, that founding of the Libertarian Party in a living room in Colorado Springs in December 1971. So that's just kind of my broad outline. I'll try to give you some signposts to kind of be like, and now I'm going to back up to the 1850s because of this. But in full disclosure for everyone, I'm not a libertarian, but I have several friends and family who are libertarians. And needless to say, my holiday gatherings are much like the debates over city business in Colorado Springs. They're full of well-meaning but often tense arguments, which will segue us right into this. So in the summer of 1971, I'm starting with that immediate context. Why does the Libertarian Party organize in 1971? The summer of 1971, the actions of the federal government, both overseas and at home, increasingly frustrate a pretty large section of the U.S. Public. Internationally, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the Nixon administration had secretly expanded the war in Vietnam. And that upsets a lot of people. Domestically, unemployment was at an all-time high. Inflation, they had been higher than they had been the previous 20 years. So those two things combined are that immediate context. In August 1971, the Nixon administration responds to the domestic situation of unemployment and high taxes by setting several price controls and wage controls in the United States. And that was in an attempt to try to tame that inflation. And also, very importantly for the founding of the Libertarian Party, in 1971, Richard Nixon unmoors the US dollar from the gold standard that had been in place since the end of World War II. So those moves infuriated fiscal conservatives and anti-tax activists around the country. It especially infuriated a growing segment of Western conservatives that were responding. They'd become this anti-New Deal faction. And they were drawing a lot of their strength from the US West. It was a faction of the Republican Party. It had grown strong enough to even rival the Eastern faction of the Republican Party by the 1970s. And that Western faction had grown so powerful that in 1964 it ran one of its own, Barry Goldwater, as the presidential candidate in 64. And then in part, Richard Nixon in 68 takes the presidency by wooing that Western faction, that kind of more libertarian tinged faction. So Nixon's policies in 71, like even though he had wooed this faction, his policy angered a lot of those libertarian-leaning Western conservatives, and they felt that Nixon and the Republican Party had essentially sold them out and betrayed them. A man in Westminster, Colorado, named David Nolan, and a few friends considered starting a new political party. It was only after 3 activists from Colorado Springs joined them that the group started the Libertarian Party of the United States. So this group, David Nolan and this group in Westminster, and then this group of 3 activists I'll talk about in Colorado Springs, they get together, and it's only after that interaction between them that they founded the Libertarian Party of the United States. Luke Zell is the person who is one of these 3 activists in Colorado Springs. It's in his living room that they found the party in December 1971, and Luke Zell becomes the first lifetime member of the Republican Party. And I'll try to explain what he brings to that. I'm a little behind on slides. Luke Zell was the president of the El Paso County Taxpayers Association. That's going to be a foundational organization for the Libertarian Party, the El Paso County Taxpayer Association. It shaped debates over city business in Colorado Springs for 50 years prior. They protested local taxes and what they called governmental overreach. So Zell and these other activists from Colorado Springs, they offer this kind of fledgling Libertarian Party decades of experience with organizing, with networking, with overall structure. So before 1971, and this is important, before 71, free market and libertarian-leaning activists believed a national party would suppress that individualism that they so wanted for libertarians to have. They felt that a national party would just be something that everyone would have to subscribe to, and it would kind of squash those differences. Zell and his friends, over the decades of success that they've had in Colorado Springs, they are the 3 activists that become part of this the founding of the Libertarian Party that convinced the others that no, there is a way to create a structure, an organization that will celebrate all these differences, provide a big tent for the libertarians, and they're the ones that kind of make that national party push possible. So I'm going to offer some deep historical context, and then we'll explore the Taxpayer Association there in Colorado Springs and this growing network of libertarian groups that kind of start to adhere to it. So that's the immediate context, 1971, and then Luke Zell, his living room. So I'm going to back us all the way up to 150 years into the 1850s. Well, even before that. Americans hate taxes. That is just period. Americans hate taxes, right? Famously, the country gets founded on one of the rallying cries of taxation without representation. And it's no surprise that a country that's founded on that kind of rallying cry would dislike any taxes, even taxes of the nation that they found, right? So a few early examples of tax rebellions. You've got Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s. You have the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s. And even the nullification crisis of the 1830s, all kind of have this hatred of taxes at their base. But they mostly fail, chiefly because the only thing bringing them all together is just a hatred of taxes. Often they don't have anything more than we all hate taxes, and then they find differences among themselves and they end up kind of falling apart. And in the 19th century, there is going to be a way of organizing that is going to make it much easier for anti-tax activists to get together, stay together, and do more than just kind of these flash in the pan revolts against taxes. And really what makes that happen, what makes that kind of efficiency possible for these anti-tax activists are railroads. Even today, the scale of railroads and what they do for the United States is baffling. It's hard to get your head around, even when you study it a lot. The railroads affected millions of people. A massive immigration system is what puts the railroads together in the American West. At the same time, it displaces hundreds of thousands of native peoples. I mean, even to the point where some of them experience genocide at the hands of some of these railroads. But it also creates a powerful new corporate organizational structure, the railroads do. So in the mid-1800s, the US Congress empowers the transcontinental railroad companies to operate in states where they don't have a corporate headquarters and to raise capital through stocks. In doing so, Congress extends two pieces of national sovereign power to these corporations. The first is the power over interstate commerce that Congress keeps. They extend some of that to the railroads to say that you can operate in these other states. The second is by allowing them to kind of raise stock on a national level, that allows them to kind of tap into the monetary ability of Congress to kind of mint coinage and those kind of things so that they can get the kind of resources they need to build these massive transcontinental railroads. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different cities and towns, even Hayes, are going to be founded because of the railroad's ability to do those very things. Colorado Springs, Denver, all of these owe their existence to the railroads and this power that they have. So that organizational model of corporations that the railroads have, other organizations quickly start adopting. And it gives this freedom of association, especially among white settlers in the US West, a very strong organizing principle. That's going to be an important organizing principle for libertarians. The Colorado Springs Company, which is the company that Colorado Springs had before it was even a town, it's a company that sells plots of land, make sure that people invest before they even move to Colorado Springs, and then they'll lay out all this infrastructure for the town before it even becomes a town. It's using this principle, this corporate organizing principle, to even create Colorado Springs. So efficiency in Colorado Springs, corporate efficiency, efficiency of association become critical, and they're the very bedrock of the town. So Colorado Springs and the US West becomes this great ground for anti-tax advocates who kind of look to that corporate model to organize. So one of the things that happens is in Colorado Springs, there is this search for the most efficient government possible that arises out of that kind of corporate organization that creates such efficiency. So by the early 20th century, even many critics of big business, such as progressives, they laud the purity and efficiency of that kind of corporate model, and they want to apply it to government. They want to bring that corporate efficiency to government. And in the 1910s and 1920s, many municipalities start adopting a form of government called the city manager form of government. And it takes a lot from that corporate model. So like corporations, the city manager form of government, it seeks to separate city councils, which are kind of like boards of directors, from the day-to-day operation of the manager, usually a professional manager, which would be the mayor in this case, or CEO in the case of a corporation. So they believe that this would eliminate corrupt political systems that happen in local governments, for one, and encourage a business level of efficiency for city governments, for the second. So Colorado Springs begins almost an obsessive quest for pure efficiency in city government using this city manager form of government. And that gets us to the Taxpayers Association of the 1920s. So I've taken us from the 1850s into Colorado Springs and its founding in the 1870s, and that they want pure efficiency. Now in the 20s, they're arguing over what efficiency actually is. Quote, the campaign of the Colorado Springs Taxpayer Association to lower taxes, read the Gazette in 1920, is on. The Taxpayers Association was a forerunner of the El Paso County Taxpayer Association I'm talking about. It first forms in 1920 to stop a paving operation for local city roads. And it drastically wants to reduce the city's tax revenue and require the city to never use bonds for any improvement, but always pay cash up front. That's what it wants to do. The Colorado Springs Taxpayers Association will become the El Paso County one. Quote, a city government, like a large corporation, has got to adjust itself to conditions which arise. The lawyer for the association, Samuel H. Kinsley, said, we have no desire to punish the city officials, but we believe this council has made some errors and seek to correct them. So the association was popular enough that it did gather enough signatures in the improvement district to have a special election, and that special election was September of 1920. In a city so consumed by those redeeming qualities of efficiency, the city council and the Chamber of Commerce, who both backed this improvement project, they both asked, they don't criticize the association for criticizing them. They don't just say, hey, well, we're the city council and that's just the way it's going to be. They say, actually, we've already paid $11,000 for this project. A special election is going to cost $5,000. So in your quest for efficiency, you're going to make us less efficient. So even there, it's very telling how they create the argument against the Taxpayers Association. They almost concede the ground of we all should be finding the most efficiency. We just think that your efficiency isn't as efficient as our efficiency. Those kind of arguments are rife in Colorado Springs. Quote, it is thought, reported the Gazette, that a number of citizens prefer to wait until the city manager form of government has been installed, which came a year later, before carrying out the paving scheme. But the voters do approve the paving scheme and the association succeed, but even though they do get it paved, the association basically has put a very kind of slow move on this pavement project. So they are somewhat successful in that they slow things down. They're not completely successful in shutting it down. But they continue to get stronger through the 20s, and by the time the Great Depression hits, they have a very large following in Colorado Springs. And by 1931, they've shed the Colorado Springs Association name and gone with the El Paso County Taxpayer Association name. They continue to believe that Colorado Springs could run more efficiently, and they continue to have these kind of pushes to get that to happen. So the Great Depression caused even more criticism of government spending with less dollars. Even the small dollars that were used were kind of criticized. So in January 1931, the association decides that they're going to fight the schools. District 11 is the big school district in Colorado Springs. They decide that they're going to try to shut down a big bond issue that the school had put through. So a local lawyer and Republican leader named Francis Schreiber, he's the one that goes to a meeting with District 11, wants them to fire 50 teachers and repay the $1.1 million bond that they had gotten from the taxpayers of Colorado Springs, repay that and basically just shrink down to almost nothing. What the person who they meet with from District 11, Ruth Banning Lewis, who's a very, very wealthy woman, she pushes back to say actually doing any of that would be illegal under these rules, and eventually the association backs off. But they find a new way to kind of push back against taxpayer spending. The city of Colorado Springs was trying to help these large numbers of job seekers in the Great Depression who didn't have work. So Earl Mosley, who was the city manager, like that efficient business city manager, he is in a meeting with these unemployed people and these business owners. Some of these business owners are part of the El Paso County Taxpayers Association. And a fight breaks out. These El Paso County Taxpayer Association people tell these unemployed people that they really are just looking for a handout and not work, and that causes them to start yelling. Earl Mosley actually kind of sides with the unemployed people because in the next day in the newspaper, he intentionally calls out, he says, I'm going to send a letter to 64 business owners, even business owners in the El Paso County Taxpayer Association, to ask for work for these unemployed people. So he even says by name, like, those people who were yelling at us, I'm also going to send you a letter. And so there's tension clearly between the city leaders and the association, even through the 1930s. And the association gets a really big kind of powerhouse name to lead it, a person named Merrill Shroop. He was the son of a former Colorado governor named Oliver Shroop. They're both Republicans, and they're both libertarian in their leanings. They want to, in the 1930s, change the city government all over again to make it more efficient. They're looking to make a smaller city government, a smaller council, and that council would turn over every couple of years instead of every 4 years. And they attacked the mayor, who was very popular. Mayor George Birdsell was his name. They get an advertisement in the city newspaper called a tax-free city or a Saturnalia of waste, which essentially attacks George Birdsell for mismanaging all this money. They again taste defeat. George Birdsell's very popular. The amended charter that they want with a smaller council, that fails. And Birdsell actually is one of the longest running mayors in Colorado Springs history. So that does fail, but that doesn't deter them from continuing to be activists. So the Great Depression, but the Second World War changes so much about Colorado Springs, and it does give a lot more power to these kind of libertarian organizations. On May 23rd, 1937, the Gazette, that paper I've been quoting from a lot, that's the main paper of Colorado Springs. The Gazette had been a Republican newspaper since 1872 when it started. The person who founds Colorado Springs, General William Palmer, he is Republican through and through, so much so that he was a Quaker pacifist, but he went to war for Abraham Lincoln on the Union side because he was so passionate in his Republican leanings and the feel that all men should be created equal, that he would take up arms in the Civil War, be estranged from the Society of Friends for his whole life. So the Republican Party is strong in Colorado Springs. In 1937, the Republican Gazette actually does away with its association to the Republican Party. And here's why. They cite the support of the New Deal by many Republicans as a reason. Quote, how is this crisis to be met? Asked the Gazette editorial board. We believe by complete political reorganization. So they break from the Republican Party in 1937. They don't realign with another political party really for a while, but not until 1946. 1946, they get bought out by the voluntarist, libertarian-leaning Hoyles family. Raymond C. Hoyles became the publisher of actually the Gazette, which was the big newspaper, but the Telegraph, which was the second largest paper, he buys both. So in 1947, Earl Mosley, that city manager who had kind of called out the business owners who weren't willing to give jobs to the jobless, he's still the city manager in 1947. He's been a city manager for 20 years almost. He asked the council for a slight increase in property taxes in 1947 to help fund this huge advertising campaign to get more military money into Colorado Springs, which is successful. If you ever drive around Colorado Springs, the amount of military money there is unreal. But the association, the El Paso County's Taxpayer Association, pushes back against that, and they convince the mayor to go around the city manager and to get these reports from different departments, which actually was outside of what the council should be able to do. So Earl Mosley stepped down. That city manager position is a revolving door for a decade after that. And you see right there begins kind of with both kind of big papers being controlled by libertarians and then the city manager kind of being ousted by this libertarian push. The libertarians become more and more they become stronger and stronger through the preceding decades. The Hoyles hire a libertarian thinker named Robert Lefebvre. He starts a freedom school. It's kind of unaccredited, but it would talk about these libertarian ideas. And that freedom school and the editorial board of the Gazette become these great big organizations for all these libertarian thinkers. They all come through Colorado Springs. And then in November 1961, they find a dynamic speaker who brings all of this together. All of these different organizations who are kind of doing these libertarian pushes here and there. They're not always on the same page, but often they're supporting each other. And then in November 1961, the Chamber of Commerce brings a very dynamic speaker to the Broadmoor Hotel for their big annual chamber retreat. That speaker is Ronald Reagan. Reagan wanted more than to just find, more efficiency for Colorado Springs. He wanted to take that efficiency, apply it nationally. He believed a conservative activism ought to be based on self-reliance, free enterprise, and freedom of association to reinstill these ideas of individual freedom. Quote, "Our free economy is the basis of our strength, and the security of the entire free world depends on our fiscal stability," Reagan claimed in a quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson. So he believed self-reliant citizens were the bedrock, and the welfare of the free economy for private businesses or religious organizations should be what keeps the welfare of the country going. And he closes his speech with this, which is just so Reagan-esque and poignant. "We must save freedom now," he warned, "or spend our sunset years telling our children what it was like when men were free." So he gives this kind of dire, should we not adopt some of these libertarian principles? The end of kind of like freedom for the United States is at hand. So by 1961, the El Paso County Taxpayer Association built up all of these alliances between these different organizations, and then Reagan's oratory kind of cements it all. Robert Lefebvre transforms the Freedom School in the 1960s into Rampart College. It's an unaccredited college, but it brings a lot of different important players into the libertarian fold. In March 1963, he used his connections with the Gazette to run a front page ad, basically getting people to come to the Rampart College. A pamphlet from 1967 into Rampart College lists the two saints of libertarian economics as advisors, and those are Frederick Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. He has Roger Millikan, who's another big libertarian thinker, Harry Hoyles, and Charles Koch, all as trustees. And an article in 1967 also showed that Charles Sly Jr., who had been president and administrative officer for the National Association of Manufacturers, the NAM, he'd become the newest trustee. So already you can kind of see this incredible libertarian network that's developing and focusing right there in Colorado Springs. Oh, I am so far back on my slides. So here's a picture of Ronald Reagan, and those quotes from the speech were from this speech here at Broadmoor Hotel for the chamber. But perhaps one of the things, this is where my research on evangelicals started to converge with libertarians. And I got so excited I want to shake people at random, coffee shops. Luckily I didn't, so. By the end of the 60s, that network of libertarians is just incredibly large, and it's making further inroads with other organizations. In March '69, the city council wanted to open a center for teenagers in downtown Colorado Springs to, quote, deal with racial problems and, quote, bridge the generation gap. The council knew if they funded this whole thing, there was going to be pushback because it's a waste of taxpayer money, so they anticipated that. And to avoid it, they bring in the El Paso County Taxpayer Association as a partial player in this Center for Youth in downtown Colorado Springs. They also bring in an evangelical organization, which is why I got all excited, which is Young Life. So they all come together to this city council meeting. The city agrees to pay $2,500 a month for this large building that they're going to rent. They'll pay the rent. They want the Libertarian El Paso County Taxpayer Association and those business owners to pay for the like electricity and water and all of the utilities essentially, and to pay for staff. And then they asked Young Life to provide the staff, the like Christian staff for this downtown center. So it's really a chance to kind of do what Reagan had voiced about 8 years earlier. It brings those religious organizations, it brings the businesses, and it brings the city all together to kind of show the superiority of freedom of association, free enterprise, and self-reliance over any kind of just sheer government intervention. And they hope that basically it can solve all those problems of the late 1960s, that the youth problem would go away, racial problems would go away. We just needed to get this conservative activism on it. And it reflects that unifying faith kind of at the core of Reagan's conservative activism, right? So ideally, that faith made government unnecessary. Like, should people just kind of get together voluntarily? We could solve all these problems. Functionally, however, it helped organizations and corporations control expensive infrastructure funded by taxes at the end of the day. But it's that center's mix of faith, business, and politics that kind of presage all the kind of neoliberalism that later swept the country in like the 80s and 90s. And it makes, this is 1969, it makes a ripe kind of environment in Colorado Springs for the founding of the Libertarian Party in Luke Zell's living room in December 1971. Okay, so the story of Colorado Springs' contribution to libertarianism, it's still relatively unknown. Those who do know, they point to like the 1946 takeover of the town newspaper by the Libertarian Raymond Hoyles, or they might point to the establishment of Rampart College in 1964 as this libertarian think tank, essentially. But those outside libertarian groups didn't just choose Colorado Springs because it was cheap and because it was beautiful scenery. They choose it because there's already that El Paso County Taxpayer Association that's there, that has the inroads with all the local leaders, that has the connections to money in Colorado Springs to fund libertarian projects. And it's that long-running 50-year El Paso County Taxpayer Association that strings all those other organizations together and eventually will make Colorado Springs one of the centers of libertarianism in the United States. And it's really that extensive activity that it has, that the Taxpayer Association has with city business, that growing network of libertarian-leaning groups, and that growing national appeal of their message that makes conditions so ripe for the Libertarian Party to become a third party in the United States and be around so long, be so popular. How fitting, of course, it began in the living room of Association President Luke Zell. And I think I even have time for some questions. Oh, yeah, Kevin.
I'm going to jump right in because
Yeah.
I have to run a need a perspective student, leave for free. What has always intrigued me about libertarianism in the American form is this, I'm going to say, grave contrast between the incredibly local concerns about a school board bond issue.
Right.
And the global rhetoric that then seems to get linked to it. The Hayekian, Misesian, Friedmanian, Reaganite, freedom itself is at stake and humanity will be ground under the jackboot of Nazism and Stalinism lest we fight this school board bond issue. That is the road to serfdom.
Yes.
I don't think Friedrich Hayek ever would have said that a school board bond issue was the road to serfdom. I don't think he ever intended anybody to say that. However, lots of his believers seem to, that is, lots of self-professed Hayekian libertarians seem to want to make that link.
Right.
Why does it stick? You've outlined the link. You're right on it. The second you started mentioning all of these details, I wanted to say, okay, where's the big freedom rhetoric? And there it was. It's fantastic. and fascinating. I didn't know the Reagan angle.
Yeah, Reagan helps to really kind of make that connection beyond just kind of these, I don't like the school board, well, I don't like what they're doing with this bond issue over here, paving the roads.
And in 2021, this crisis is staring us in the face and about to tear our noses off.
Right.
School boards are where Americans are at each other's throats politically, over what I may venture to say is the same nonsense. If we allow a school board to say this about how to educate our children or how to build a building or how to do this, that, or the other thing, freedom itself is at stake, and we're all going to become, insert ism here.
Right.
Why does this stick? Why is this so dramatically persuasive? Just at the biggest level.
And I've been kicking this around. This is what I need to do. This is why I'm giving these talks, so I can kind of think through that very thing. Like, how can I better connect what's going on the ground locally in Colorado Springs to these high-flung kind of global concerns often. And so here's a couple things that I'm just processing. One of those things is Colorado Springs is an incredibly Republican, incredibly progressive place. With what they did, they wanted to get the people who had the largest investments in the U.S. West to buy a vacation home in Colorado Springs. Mm-hmm. That's what they wanted. And then they had to find some way to control the people that they didn't want in Colorado Springs. And they did that partly through kind of debates like this, partly through religion. They make Christianity, they give churches that are temperate, like any church that's willing to kind of get behind their temperance clause, they give them free land, and they want them to kind of organize that way, and then they can get all the miners and all the railroad workers who are drinking out of Colorado Springs while allowing the rich people to drink and do whatever. They don't really care if rich people are doing it in their own,
As long as it's Broadmoor Hotel.
Right, exactly. If it's the Broadmoor Hotel or basically over the line, then you're fine. One of the things that I'm grappling with the most, those progressive ideas turn into what we would call conservative ideas.
You mean more capital P progressive ideas?
Yes,
at the beginning of the, right,
mm-hmm.
Right. And that's a clashing thing to me, right? Efficiency is capital P progressive.
Absolutely.
From what we now, blinded by our left-right Republican Democratic rhetoric, cannot see. And there's also the money angle.
Mm-hmm.
That, of course, it's all about government money. It's all about government giving land to people. That was the railroad companies. That was
even Colorado Springs giving it to...
appropriating it from Native Americans,
mm-hmm.
et cetera, right? That underlying discourse is there. Of course, all the big think economic libertarians are ludicrously obsessed with fiat money. And the gold standard,
yes.
To the point of laughability. Of course, now they're all cryptoizing and doing all that other pseudo-libertarian stuff. It all sticks together at so many levels, but it takes root right in our communities. It's fascinating.
And part of the way it works so well in Colorado Springs is they do manage to attract that insanely, the money that they are able to get in Colorado Springs, the people that they attract for vacation homes. They have the biggest railroad executives. They have all of these very well mining magnates. They use all of that money and they funnel it into marketing of Colorado Springs. And they do that phenomenally well, even to the point where there is a motion on the Senate floor right after World War II to make Colorado Springs the new Washington, D.C. Because they've got their senator in their back pocket, and he's willing to kind of just throw this idea out there for fun. It never makes it anywhere, right? But we could think of how much less it would, like, we've got land so cheap here, and we could buy all these buildings, and it has kind of, what they managed to do is create Colorado Springs as this place that's uniquely American. And the founder actually calls Colorado Springs, he wanted to make it the inner temple of Americanism. He talked about both coasts being this kind of castle garden that would allow all these immigrants it would teach the immigrants Americanism, and by the time they got to Colorado Springs, they would be truly American anyway.
There's your libertarian evangelical link.
Yes.
The city on the hill, the
Exactly,
pure
or right next to a
Protestant
mountain.
rhetoric, right? Nobody's going to interpret the scriptures or the nature of freedom except me, myself, and I for me, myself, and I.
And they have all that money in marketing to do that and make that case. Even to the 1990s, the governor of Colorado, somebody said, they were talking about this ultra kind of patriotic group, and the governor of Colorado said, it sounds like some kind of group that would headquarter in Colorado Springs. Yeah.
When you first spoke about linking up with the youth life, is that what it was?
Young Life, yeah.
Young Life, and they rented that building. Was there any opposition? Because that seems like that was kind of like a separation of church and state.
Yes. In fact, the opposition wasn't namely about the separation between church and state, even though those kind of battles were being fought in the 60s and then the 70s. The issue that most of the libertarian business owners objected to was the fact that the city was paying that $2,500 in rent every month. They said, we would be behind this as long as the government's paying absolutely nothing, no taxpayer money. So it's interesting because you would think they would be like, I don't like this church and state issue, when in fact they were like, I don't like this government funding issue. I was surprised that they were able to get them on board for either one, because those libertarian business owners and the libertarian movement there in Colorado Springs, we're talking people who are so vastly different, right? We're talking like the Koch brothers, but we're also talking Lefebvre, the one who started Rampart College, who actually attracted the Koch brothers to all of these different things and got a lot of money from them. He's kind of like free love. He was in relationships with multiple women at the same time. I mean, for a CEO to kind of be associated with somebody like that, but it all falls under this libertarian, well, we all have such freedom of association that you do what you want, I'll do what I want, and everything is kind of brought together by that fiscal conservatism. But amazingly, those business owners don't object to the fact that Young Life's a part of it. They object more that the city council is a part of it.
Was that the first time that had kind of like a Christian connection?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, and I've been really looking closely. So yeah, 1969, and you have to remember too that 1969 is this weird year that maybe the possibility of bringing social conservatives like Young Life with fiscal conservatives who don't really worry about morality in that kind of way, at least, together, because there's all that activism, there's all the protests against Vietnam, and they're trying to find some solution. So if they can get, even people who think very differently on board, maybe we could fix this somehow. That's my only, but you're right. I mean, it's such a weird bedfellows, I guess. And what becomes the Republican Party under Reagan is going to have those people all together, but they're not comfortable with each other, certainly. They weren't comfortable with each other there in the city council meeting, and yet something kind of brings them all together, which is what brings them all together? What Kevin's saying. I'm still grappling with that, but yeah, good point.
Did you find any connection between the John Birch Society and Libertarianism?
Not so far in Colorado Springs. The John Birch Society is notoriously hard to track down. It's often, you might find a local chapter, but they are so much a part of the freedom of association that they even correspond very little among themselves. It's hard to there's no real good historical treatment of the John Birch Society because of that very reason. They're so decentralized. It's hard to go to, well, here's the John Birch archive, and I can just kind of park here and do all my research. You kind of have to hit every single one, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. But I have yet to see any connection between the John Birch Society, at least in Colorado Springs, and these libertarians. It is an interesting society too, because it certainly leans towards some of those business ethics that are kind of libertarian, but John Birch himself was kind of this martyr for a lot of evangelicals because he was over in China fighting communist China. He was a missionary, but also covertly a CIA operative. So the John Birch Society is a great, like, it's doing kind of what we're talking about. Like, it's bringing some of these kind of libertarian-leaning business owners, but it also is bringing those social conservatives all together in an organization. But I have not found any John Birchers in Colorado Springs as of yet. And it could just be that whoever was running those societies in Colorado Springs did not take their papers and give them to the archives I've been in. And I've been to just about every single one of them.
I know Charles Coates' father was a big shot in the John Birch Society.
Was he?
In Wichita.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll have to track that down too, because there's a lot of connections between Colorado Springs and Kansas. They ran a lot of articles in Kansas newspapers essentially saying, it's really hot and windy in the summer in Kansas. Why don't you come up to Colorado Springs where it's 6,000 feet and nights get down to 60 degrees and it's very nice. And so a lot of wealthy Kansans had cabins and all sorts of things in Colorado to get away from the Kansas heat. So I'll have to look into that more closely. Wichita and John Birch and Coke. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Anybody want to? I should say, if you do want to read some interesting scholarship.
Sponsorship. It was done by private citizens with a missionary aspect to develop what is now Tanzania, Cameroon, Namibia, and Togo. And finally, the state had to take over because of the exploitative genocidal intent. The external colonization. The other would be contemporary Russia, where the Orthodox Church is being brought dramatically back into the power of the state in its re-totalitarianization of United Russia and Putin's power.
One of my best friends is an Afghanist.
And German colonialism,
Yeah.
boy, that's your friend right now.
Yeah,
It's
that would be
huge,
very
huge,
fascinating. Sure. Okay, now we're running really close to time. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. This was terrific. Support for evangelical organizations. So I don't really, I haven't quite figured out like that touchstone of what makes it all make sense, if that makes any sense. I mean, they're not populist in the sense of like the Kansans around here were populists for sure. I'm still wrestling with it. They have so much power over the U.S. West. And to be able to do such a good job at marketing their town as like the place, the most American place, that's what I'm fascinated by. It's so successful. I still am shocked at how they did that, you know? Well, thank you all so much. I still have some time, so if anyone wants to come up, but I'll let everyone go. And thank you all for your questions and for listening to me and help me think this out. I do want to turn this into something to publish, so I'm up here kind of thinking through those very things. This is very helpful to get some feedback like this. I appreciate it.